Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. 2024, what a great time to start thinking about not only growing our business, but actually in the future selling our business. If you're building a business, you might as well look at it as an asset. And with an asset, of course, we want it to increase in value and at some point be able to sell it. My dear and old friend, Steve Juetten, we've known each other for probably a decade now. And after having a very successful financial services firm, which he sold at a great rate as well, he now works with business owners, investment advisors, people both in and outside the financial investment space to prepare their business to get ready for sale as far as 5 or 10 years out, and then right through to the 2 and 1 year mark where he's a little more involved to make sure that you're maximizing the value of that asset, leaving in a really professional way that takes care of the new owner and probably more importantly your clients, and maximizes the value of that asset so that you go on and do your next thing. So Steve, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Chris. Nice introduction, and I appreciate it. Yeah, I think you and I have known each other more than a decade now, and somehow or another we never age. I don't get that, but
Well, from what I understand from trauma, you only block out 10 years. So even though it was longer, I've probably compartmentalized just to deal with the abuse that you give me on a regular basis. So to return that abuse to you, I know that you agreed to come on and answer a few questions about, some of the common stuff that I hear from clients. I've come up with a little more than a few. And so I'm going to invite you to answer questions kind of as long as you want to. And then, at any point where it's enough, you let me know and we'll maybe pick it up on a future show. But so kind of maybe give people a little bit of insight into your process of selling your business, maybe a little preamble of how long you had your financial services company and then making the decision to sell and then what that process looked like for you.
sure, thanks. So I had my own business for over 20 years, and then at 5 years before I wanted to be gone, I sat down with you actually and said, okay, how do we get from where we are to where I want to get to? And we laid out a process that would do two things. One, it would enhance the value of the business. And I think that was really important because this isn't something you change right away. It takes a while. And two, get us to the point where we needed to get to. And so over that 5 year period, first we fixed the business up and made it more attractive to a buyer. And then towards the end, we started the very specific steps to get the business sold to a buyer that would treat our clients the way we wanted them to be treated. And in the midst of that, we also had COVID. And so that was just one of the challenges that got thrown in the way. But it worked out well when all was said and done. And then in 2022, I sold the business to we split it in two. We sold it to an existing advisor, one half of the business, and the other half we sold to another advisor that I had known for quite a long time. So all in all, very successful. And one of the ways you judge that, of course, is how many clients stay with the advisor that you sold them to. And we only lost 2 clients out of well over 100. And so I would consider that very much a success. And to give you your props, you were invaluable in that and couldn't have done it without you.
I think there was a recording glitch. Maybe just repeat that last part one more time. And so, and I mean, it is true. And I think, there's lots of different ways that you've shared with me that you've kind of dialed in on how somebody can exit their business. And one would be selling to an existing person in the business, right? So like an heir, it could be a family member or even just a junior that's moving up. It could be to a trusted colleague. Or in some firms, they might sell back into a pool, right? One of the national chains or so on. There's options there. And even maybe an outsider, you might almost put it out to a bid, put it out to an auction, letting potential buyers know that your business is for sale. And so I think, there's a lot of mechanics in that. A lot of people get kind of buried in it going, I have 100 different questions. The question that I always hear, which you probably hear as well, the first question is, well, how do I know what my business is worth? And so what's the process that a business owner goes through with you to kind of figure out, ballparking, is this actually worth anything?
Great. Yes, it is the first question. Inevitably, you will hear, how much can I get for the business or what is it worth? And so we start with the process of assessing the value of the business. And without going too far into the weeds, after looking at the financials and the trend line and the number of clients that are likely to stay or the number of customers that are likely to stay, we can come to a pretty good idea of it. Now, that doesn't mean it's a formal valuation, but we can ballpark it by just looking at the financials and the trend lines, and particularly growth and a turnover and profitability as we go along. And Chris, you and I have talked about profitability a lot. Most business owners don't really understand the concept of profitability. But by just looking at it, we can come up with an idea of what the new owner is going to take home. And that's the key. And then we look at what is the marketplace for the business that you're in. And I don't want to overstate it. There are some businesses that are hot and some businesses that are not. But primarily, you want a business that has retained earnings or that will continue to produce earnings for the new owner. And this is a process that we can go through in a conversation. But ultimately, you're going to need a formal valuation as well. The first step, though, is let's get close. And you and I will talk about it as we go along. The number one reason most businesses don't sell, even when they're on the market, is unrealistic expectations about the value. And I had somebody say this to me one time. You think your house is a castle, and somebody that's trying to buy it thinks it's a hovel. And that's exactly what happens with a business. It's your business. You've grown it. It's your baby. You think it's the greatest thing in the world. But a buyer looks at it and sees all the warts and all the things that are wrong with it. So to find that realistic number, we have to be honest with each other and work our way through the value of the business in the eyes of a buyer. And that's the key, the eyes of a buyer.
What I remember you saying to me maybe a year or so ago, that a lot of times when an owner is thinking about selling, even if they're thinking about selling, a lot of times people are like, I'm just going to close it down, right? I'm done, close shop and go. But what you had said, I think, is that, as that business is starting to get closer to a retirement, they actually start to let it get a little dilapidated, right? They stop having that excitement about making sure that the business is run every way. And what you said is, often when you'll come in, even before evaluation happens, you can look and go, these are a couple things that we can tighten up that will increase the value. Like a handyman going in and saying, if we paint and put in new carpet, we can increase the value of this house from hovel to castle by 20 or 30,000 bucks. And so I remember I've shared that with clients. What you shared with me is, if you have somebody come in early like you, have a conversation about what is it and what do you want it to be worth, and then you give it a spitball. It's probably somewhere around here. Then get that valuation done. It probably justifies to that owner it's worth doing the extra little bit of work in the short term to make sure they get most out of it. Now, question number 2. How long will it take to sell? That's a question, I think probably the second question I always get after, how much can I get? How long does it take? So on average, what have you seen from a duration point from when somebody goes, I want to sell, to actually being able to sell?
Yeah, 1 to 2 years is what I tell people is realistic. Because when you do the assessment, we'll go back to the house analogy, we're going to find stuff that just needs to be fixed up in the eyes of a buyer. It could be your financial records may not be current, or you might not have good information on your customers or something. 1 to 2 years is going to be typical. Now, we also have an SOS version of this where an owner says, I have to go right away. And it could be because of health or whatever the reason is. And so we can accelerate it. But I always tell business owners, if you're going to accelerate it, you're going to get less value. So there's the trade-off between the two of those. But if a business owner came to me today, all other things being equal, 1 to 2 years is reasonable. And yes, you are right. It is the second question we get. And there are things that can accelerate it, and there are things that can slow it down. But if a business owner wants to do it in a reasonable time frame, 3 years would be a good place to start, to be honest, because you will then have the opportunity to maximize the value and be particular about what happens with your customers and your employees or your contractors. And you'll have more time to do the things that need to be done. But sometimes owners just get to the point, as I'm sure you've seen, where it's just, I'm done, I'm out, And if I can make them hang on for a couple of years, then we've done something good.
Well, and that's always the scary thing I see, right, is they get burned out, they get tired, especially after COVID. We saw a lot of business, at least I did, that closed not because of lack of business, but because of the sheer effort it took to try to stay open during COVID. And it's heartbreaking to me to watch somebody who may have put in 5, 10, 20, 30 years into a business. It's like renovating a car or restoring a car. and then just being like, anyone can take it for $500, or I'm just going to scrap it.
Yeah.
And so with that, my third question I hear, and I probably you do too, is when is the right time to sell? And so to precursor that, you've told me that often you start working with clients 5 years out from when they think they might like to retire. And I remember saying to you, that seems like a long time. But you said like that year 5 and 4 are just starting to plan the idea of, this is the end date. When do I want to start to get things organized so that they're not rushed and kind of devaluing the business? So I guess that's a long-winded way of asking the question. How does somebody know when it's the right time for them to sell their business?
Well, I'm going to go back to the goals that we start with every business owner, which is what are you trying to do here? Do you have to be out at a certain time, or do you want to be out at a certain time? And do you need a certain number? So we have that conversation. For many business owners, a business is a very substantial part of their net worth. And they have in mind, I need to get X or Y, whatever the number is. So if we can have that conversation, then we know. But broadly, I always say you want to sell on the upswing, right? All businesses go do this, right? You don't want to sell when the business is starting to decline. You want to sell on the upswing. And that's why the 5-year out model is the best one, because we can figure out how to get you to that upswing and make it look really, really good. So you want to sell during an upswing if you can. And by upswing, I mean profitability. And
Right.
to some extent, new business coming in as well.
And I guess that's true. Is I guess if you're starting before you think you need to, i.e., the 5 years out, it might be the perfect time. Might be 2.5 years after they first talk to you. Like maybe it's not 5 years. Maybe they're like, we're ramping up right at the right time. Let's get out of here now because we're going to get the number that you and they discuss. This is my exit number, and so they don't want to miss that gap. Talk to you 2 years out and go, the best time to sell was, 3 months ago. That would be a killer.
That would be a killer. And that's exactly right. Now, again, for people that are listening, you don't have to do it at 5 years. We're just talking about optimum. We do the same process if it's 3 years even. Let's try to figure out, you've got 3 years and then you have to be gone. What can we do to fix it so that we're on the upswing as much as possible? It's
Right.
just harder to do in a shorter period of time because most businesses aren't that nimble.
Right.
It's moving the super tanker, right? But in general, we want to be on an upswing, and the longer we have to make it on an upswing, the better. It's the old, what do we need to stop doing, start doing, and keep doing to make the business look really good?
Well, what's funny? You've heard me say before, what drives me crazy is people spend more time planning their wedding and planning their vacations than they do planning their business. And I'm thinking, doing all of this for so many years to only go, yeah, I think I'm going to close in 3 months. Let me see if I can find somebody. It's like going to the airport and going, where do we want to go on holiday? I mean, it can be pretty expensive. Now, speaking of that, once somebody is thinking about, okay, I know when I want to exit, I kind of know my number of where I want to go. The next thing is I got to get somebody to pay that number. And so where are common places a business owner would look to find buyers?
A great question. And it is one of the questions that will inevitably come up. And this is where you and I can have a little bit of a dialogue about it. I can tell you that there are about a dozen places to look.
Wow.
And the owner will choose what makes the most sense for them. But first you look internally and see if there is a successor. Do we have a succession plan in place? Because bar none, an internal transition is the best for clients and customers because it's the least disruptive.
Right.
Getting somebody to take over. So you look internally first. Second thing that you look at is look at competitors. Because if there is a competitor in the business and you're in the XYZ business, find somebody else that you admire in that business. And you find those people by just being in the industry, going to industry groups, or who your competitors are. And I will just tell you that when I sold my business, I probably made 6 calls to other advisors that I had never even met and had good conversations with them. And the conversation was, I'm thinking about doing this. Are you interested? What do you do? What's your plan? Where do you see this business kind of going? So the second one is competitors. The third one is the third source anyway, is going to be, and I don't like to do this unless I absolutely need to. You can list your business on some of the sites that are out there on the internet, And there are a lot of those sites out there. They're kind of like a job board,
Right.
and you can do it anonymously. It's not like you need to say, "Hey, the Steve and Chris or the Chris and Steve business is for sale." You just describe the business and see what you can get from that. Another one that is relatively new, and I think you and I have talked about it. There's a lot of private equity firms that are out there looking to acquire businesses.
Right.
Now, for those of you that don't know what a private equity firm is, it's just what it sounds like. It's a pool of money brought together by investors, and they're looking to make their money grow by acquiring businesses. And so the private equity businesses are starting to buy other private equity firms are starting to buy other businesses because it's a great way to grow your business. And they go out and they find organizations that they like to buy. So I have contacts with a number of private equity firms that are right now happen to be in the financial services space. And then after that, then you can actually find a business broker that will help you list a business as well. So those are five. And there's pros and cons to all of them. And one of the things that I would say when you're doing this is if you start to think about selling the business, it's amazing how many more opportunities will come up. You will find places. You will find other opportunities and you'll find firms and hey, I thought about this. What would you add to that, Chris? What did I miss?
Well, I think that's key. And what you're talking about is we go back to kind of a previous part of your conversation is if your business is valuable, you're not selling a business, you're selling cash flow. And so if you think of it as a cash flow mindset first, in your case, an investment advisor who's already running a profitable book would be very interested in buying another profitable book. Not to say they couldn't build it themselves, but why wouldn't they just buy that cash flow and get that rolling right away? And I've seen this kind of in restaurants and, in real estate, when you talk about private equity, I mean, we see these, private equity are becoming property managers, right? They're buying up houses, neighborhoods, and so on. I think that if you have a profitable business, the little challenge is you don't really want to flash to your clients that you're selling before you tell them, because that can freak them out. They decide to ditch, and then of course the value goes down. But if you on the inside track say, I'm entertaining if the right suitor came along with a fair offer and a good transition plan, that would be a conversation I'd be open to having. Then it won't freak your clients out because you're like, hey, I'm thinking, and again, 3 to 5 years out about what I want to make sure the clients are cared for if I decide to retire. So buy yourself a little bit of time. But I've personally got deals where I bought businesses from neighbors and friends and people I went to high school with. I mean, it doesn't have to be the paths that you laid out are obviously the ones that make the most amount of sense. But when you're ready, and again, under the guidance of someone like you that can kind of script that conversation properly, you can start to let people know through your spouse, friendship groups. You'll start to get some good opportunities to chew on.
Good points. All to that end, by the way, I recently received a query from a friend of my wife's or a client of my wife's. And she just happened to mention to my wife, I'm thinking about selling my business. And my wife said, I have somebody that I can have you talk to. And so it's amazing how all those things come about if you just start thinking about it and start mentioning it to your trusted colleagues and family and friends and neighbors, as you say, it'll pop up. Now, I will also tell you that the confidentiality part of it worries every business owner because they don't want to freak out their customers, their clients, their employees, their suppliers, and all that. So we have to find a fine line in there. We have to find a balance, but you just have to start to get the word out.
Well, I guess that's where the planning comes in, right? You don't just kind of decide and fire it, shotgun it at the market. You kind of have to have some strategy in place to make that work. And so leads me to my next question. Actually, a nice segue is it's one thing to find a buyer, but how do you find a qualified buyer? So what are some of the things an owner would look at in order to decide if the potential suitor is a real opportunity or somebody that's just kicking tires?
It's a great question. And it starts with mindset because it's really going to be, you're going to do due diligence on the potential buyer as the buyer does due diligence on you and your business. So it's a two-way street. And too many sellers that I have talked to don't do their due diligence. And it's a little bit like dating. Nobody's going to ever show you all of their situation right off the bat. You have to go a little bit at a time. And I'll just use this my own experience. One of the people that bought my half of my business, there are some things about the way this person is operating that I wish I had known. It's not good or bad, but I wish I had known. And I didn't ask enough deep questions about that. And those are the kinds of things. You want to look at a couple of items. You want to look at how they treat their customers. So if it's somebody in the industry, the first question you want to find out is, how do they treat their customers? And that will give you a great insight. Second question is, how do they treat their employees or their contractors? That will give you insight into that. And then you can dive into the other parts of it, which is, how are they going to finance it? Are they expecting you to have are they going to do an earnout? And I should probably explain an earnout.
Yeah.
Many owners have the idea that they're just going to get an all upfront cash payment. And Chris, I don't think that happens very often, does it?
No, there's always some version of vendor financing in 90% of deals.
So an earnout or vendor financing is, okay, we'll pay you X up front, and then we will pay you a certain amount over a period of time. For example, $50,000 a year over 5 years or something like that. And it can be a note, it can be a performance. But the second part of the equation here is, how are they going to finance this? Are they going to borrow the money? And what kind of terms and conditions are they going to put on you? So there's a fit in terms of the business fit and the way they treat people. And then there's the financial fit as it applies to you. So Chris and I have developed a list of, what do we call that, Chris? The magic 88.
Right.
The 88 questions that we want to ask about a potential buyer to see if they are a good fit or not. And it's different for every business, and it's different for every owner. But you're going to be doing due diligence as much as the potential buyer is doing due diligence. And look for fit first, in my mind. Look for that way that they do business.
I remember when that list, we were coming up with that, and you shouldered that responsibility. And I remember going, let's come up with 20 or 30. But then when you start to look at it, this is, and we have a joke in venture capital where we're like, you have to learn how to kill your baby, right? Your baby is the business that you birthed. And so, I'm being a total hypocrite, because you're like, you got to kill your baby, right? Give it to someone else to run. But when it comes down to it, especially with clientele, you don't want to just dump your company onto somebody that has the money. You want to make sure that you're placing that clientele who entrusted you with their business to someone who will take as good of care of them as you did. And so as we were starting to run through the questions, I remember we were like, wow, we're over 50. Wow, we're over 60. And so this is not certainly a list that you would give to a potential buyer. This is what you're doing behind the scenes as your own due diligence to make sure this person is worthy of the business, but as importantly, the clientele. You don't want to sell it to them just because they have the money, because it's your reputation. 30 years of reputation, giving it to the wrong person, not a great way to take care of your clients in the end.
Exactly. Well put. And it's hard when you are in the throes of selling the business,
right?
Because now you see the end is in sight and you're really starting to get excited about it. And that's the part where a trusted advisor or a coach can slow you down a little bit and say, is this really consistent with your long-term goals? And it's so hard when you're in it all by yourself. I cannot say that enough. And that having Chris available to help me as I panicked on several occasions, you just need that outside voice that says, now slow down, let's think this through, because it's a very emotional time. There's no doubt about it. Selling a business you've grown is a very emotional time, and having an outside trusted source that can slow you down. Now, I will also tell you that this is not, this can be fun. This can be fun. You don't have to make it a drudgery, but it's emotional, and you just have to recognize that going in.
Well, it's almost the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. And sometimes the new one is a bit scary, right? Because you're really used to the old one. And so it's great. I'm actually going to move my questions around because, again, kind of a brilliant segue is we talked about when the business owner might be ready to sell. But so how does the business owner objectively know when their business is ready to sell? And the adage that pops into my head is when we first got a housekeeper when we were in university, my wife, girlfriend at the time, used to clean up before the housekeeper came. And I used to go, hey, like, it's why we are both working and going to school, so we can have a housekeeper. But she would tidy the kitchen before the housekeeper came to tidy the kitchen. And so in my mind, she wasn't ready to have a housekeeper yet, even though in theory it was good. So how does a business owner know that aside from them being ready, the vehicle, the business, is ready to be transferred to someone else?
It's a great question and a good story. I hadn't heard that one before. That's good. So what we tell people that are considering it is we want to do a SWOT analysis. We want to look at your business and look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And if you've never done a SWOT analysis, it's really just an internal look at how are we doing, and you have to do it honestly. And if you do that analysis and you look at what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what opportunities are we missing, and what are threats to our business? And I was having this conversation with somebody the other day. In fact, she has a PR firm, and she sees artificial intelligence and Chat GPT as a threat to her business. And that
Okay.
is devaluing her business as we go along. We have to realize that. So the conversation is around, okay, I agree, right? But what are the opportunities that we can use in that regard? And so it was a mental turn for her. She was not very happy about it, but it was kind of done to her. They have many strengths in that business as well. They have terrific people. They have a really good customer base. But one of the items that they're struggling with is that they've had, and again, this is a PR business, they've had a fair number of turnover. So their people are turning over. And as a result of all of this, their revenues are on a downward trend. So for many years, they were upward, now they're down. So the business owner needs to be realistic and say, given the strengths that we have, which is we've got a primo client base, a weakness is that we are losing some of our people. Another weakness is that our trend is downward in terms of profitability. But what about the opportunities? Well, the opportunities are we can take advantage of that great client base and maybe expand what it is that we do for those clients. Instead of doing the same thing, let's think of some new things we can sell to those clients who we've known a long time. And then the external threats. So an owner will know that their business is ready to go if they look at all of those items and it comes up positive. Again, to use the analogy, looking at a house, how will you know when the house is ready? Well, in the eyes of the buyer, is there anything that needs to be done? And does it look like it's going to continue to gain value going forward? So in the case of this PR firm, I advised her we need to spend 2 to 3 years and get this thing fixed up. Because right now they're not going to get anything close to what it is that they want.
So
What
that's
would you?
like, well, that's like what you're saying is they have to come up with the number and then come up with a realistic, where are you starting right now? So we want it to be worth $1 million. You're spitballing and you're like, it's worth about 600,000. To get it to $1 million over 2 years, here are all the things we would need to fix, which leads me to my next question. And this is more of a, you kind of dishing, giving some insider is, when you're looking at a business for the first time with a client, what is the area or areas where you're like, okay, these need to be addressed right away? Like where are most businesses? I think I know, but where are most businesses deficient, or there needs to be some tidying and or backfilling? What have you noticed?
It's a great question, and obviously these are generalizations to some extent dependent on the industry. But the first thing is cash flow. Are we cash flowing? Are we creating profit for the company? And without going into it too far, but if the cash flow isn't good, there's no way you're going to sell that business. And by good, I mean we really want to see that they're able to generate a decent return. And I'm not going to give you a percentage because again, it depends on the industry. But if I look at the numbers and you are not cash flow positive, hopefully with that number growing, then that's where we're going to start. The second thing we look at is what status, how good are the books and the records and everything. Nothing will turn a buyer off faster than having out of date or incomplete financial records or even organizational records. And that includes, do you have up-to-date operating procedures? Because if you're the owner and you're going to leave, and all the institutional knowledge is in your head, that's going to be a problem for a buyer. So first, let's get cash flow. Second, let's make sure that all your records are current and up to date. And then there are some other things that you'll look at. For example, are your contracts assignable? We need to look at those. Do you have agreements with your customers, and do you have contracts with them? Those kinds of things. So then you get into some of the nitty gritty. We can't forget the legal part of it as well. If your business is not organized well, and maybe you aren't current on your filings and things like that, then it's going to be harder. But we start with cash flow, then we look at books and records and systems, and then we work our way down from there. Finally, we look at the owner, by the way. And if the owner is trying to do too much, if the business is all by them, that's going to be an issue. And I use what I call the vacation rule, which is if the owner can go away for 2 weeks and the business keeps running, the owner goes away on vacation, then we're probably okay. But if the owner has not taken a 2-week vacation and is checking in all the time, that's probably not a business that is ready to be turned over. What would you add? What would you add?
Well, I think that's a great, as you were talking about that, I'm like, it happens all the time when we look to buy a business, right? With our venture firm, I'll say, do you have up-to-date financials? And they'd say, oh yeah, I think we have 2023 done. And I'm like on any day I've got my 2 monitors here as we're talking. I can look at the dashboard to see exactly how much money the company made today, this month, this year, against projections. Like I'm anally retentive when it comes to numbers. And then I'll say, question number 2, which you and I have kind of joked about, is I'll say, do you have any outstanding tax issues? The only right answer is no. But people will say, I don't think so.
Not the right answer.
And so that's not the right answer, right? I want you to say, no, everything is paid in full. And then what I love about what you said about the 2-week vacation, which I'm going to steal, by the way, is I didn't know if Go Theou was sustainable, and we were 11 years in. Because I did take holidays, but I actually took a full year off, as you'll remember. I took a year off where I stopped running the company, and I had my number 2 do that. And about a month in, I'm like, this company could be sold today, because I theoretically made myself irrelevant. And that's what you want to do, is you want this company to run, whether you show up or not. You should show up because you're leading, but if you decide to take 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, that company's running without you. And any company that I've sold, they've always said, what role do you play in the business? And I'm like, I'm the guy that hunts up the business and I bring it in. But when I sell a company, it's like a chef selling a restaurant. I got to have all the recipes. I'm not taking the recipes. I teach anyone that's buying my companies, I have everything documented, including how I close business step by step. That's what they're buying. And I think that's a key thing. Even as you said that, I'm like, I know that, but it's not front of mind of that everything has to be able to be done without you being there. Mm-hmm. And I would assume, Steve, even if you're working with clients at that 5-year mark, working them back, how many do we see that don't have any systems written down? They're all up in their head, and you're like, you need to start documenting.
Right, and exactly. A business owner becomes the business. Most business owners start the business because they love X, Y, or Z. They love baking pastry or coaching or whatever the case may be. And they never start the process of documenting what they do and how they do it. And then when you get ready to sell it, that's a liability. And so when we're assessing a business, we do look at the financials, obviously, but then we look at records, just like you said. And then we look at standard operating procedures. And then we always apply the 2-week rule. If this business can't run while you're gone for 2 weeks, and by the way, you don't get to check in every day. You don't get to be on the phone while you're gone. You really have to be gone for 2 weeks.
Right.
And you really do need to make yourself irrelevant. That doesn't mean you don't have things that you're doing, because obviously you're contributing. But that's how an owner, which is how we started, that's how an owner will know his or her business is ready to go. If we can do check on financials and check on standard operating procedures and check on legal issues and books and records, and can the business run without them, then the business is ready to be sold.
And so kind of going with that, because you had talked about legal and financials, at what point do you let your lawyer and your accountant know that you're thinking about a sale? And then is there anything conversation starters or stuff that you would suggest for a business owner with their accountant and lawyer that they should be talking about, like tax implications? Or I'm just kind of talking out of the kind of the top of my head, but when would you tell your professional talent that you're thinking about selling, and what are some of the conversations that they normally have with the lawyer or the accountant?
Sure. So, is generally speaking, a couple of years before we're going to get there, and I'll tell you why, is that both have a different perspective. The attorney, you can say to the attorney, what do we need to do from a legal standpoint? Are we ready to do are all our filings up to date? Is there anything going on that we need to have a conversation about? And are there any law changes I need to be aware of? Because that's what you have them for,
Oh,
right?
mm-hmm.
And for the CPA or whoever is doing your taxes, the question is, what are the tax implications of the sale of my business? And the CPA will, if they're any good, will tell you the way that it's going to be treated, and from a tax standpoint, including the earnout, assuming that there is one. And then you can also, depending on where we are in this process, if your books and records are not current, then you can also get the CPA to bring you current and bring everything up to date that needs to be done. And I think, Chris, you're probably exceptional in this area. Many businesses do not have a good handle on what's going on a day-to-day basis, but at least monthly, right?
Right.
We need to have a bookkeeper in there doing your balance sheet and your P&L and all those other kinds of things. So if the owner is not doing that, that's the time to get the CPA to get going on that part of it as well. Now, if your business is multi-state or international, then I back it up even a year further than that. Because a lot of the ways that taxes are treated are done by, here in the US, are done by state. Okay, so there's a federal implication, but there's also a state implication. So if you're multi-state, you may need to start even earlier than that. And I also would say that you need to be clear with the CPA and the attorney what you want them to do and when you want them to do it. So I'll just use the attorney as an example. You're going to have an attorney that will look at your documents, the purchase and sale documents, and the buyer is going to have an attorney that does that as well. And you want to have your attorney up front. And as the seller, here's a little key, as a seller, you want to draft documents. You want them
Okay.
reacting to your documents, not you reacting to their documents. And that's another element in the due
Oh,
diligence. When you're doing it, you can just say, oh, and I have my attorney drafting the purchase sale agreement, and I'll expect that your attorney will look it over. But this is one of the things that I tell business owners. You want to drive the paperwork.
right.
So make sure you've told your attorney that you're going to do that. There's another entity that might be involved in this too that you didn't mention, which is an escrow company. So
Oh,
you might want to put money in escrow. And so if you don't have an escrow company, you can ask your CPA for it. But sometimes money is put in escrow depending on what needs to happen in the first 6 months of the first year or whatever the case may be. And a good escrow company can help you, again, using a house sale as an example, right? You need that intermediary that's holding on to money.
right.
So, for example, in several cases that I've dealt with, the buyer put money in escrow depending on the seller doing certain things, right? And that way the money is at risk. And the same way, the money is at risk if the buyer doesn't do certain things. So
Right.
sometimes you use an escrow agency as well.
Well, you know what, and as you were talking there, and this is probably the stuff that you cover, as I was thinking as you're talking about the accountant and the lawyer and even the escrow company. But if we think of the accountant, what I've always kind of joked about, if we take a position in a company that, let's say, their bookkeeping hasn't been good, we know their numbers are good, but their bookkeeping isn't good, your accountant can put a lot of lipstick on a pig. And what I mean by that is they can clean up your financials 7 years back, catch up on all of the filings. So at the point when a buyer comes in, you can say, here are our up-to-date filings, here are our up-to-date financials. They don't know that maybe you have had messy books for a couple of years. So that account, it's going to cost you a little bit of money to tidy it up, but it doesn't report anywhere, oh, Steve didn't do his books in 2019. It just
Right.
shows were they done or not done. And so, and then with the lawyer, because I'm going to have a question in a few about the different people that are impacted by the sale of the company. But I'm thinking that that lawyer, if they know you're going to sell, they know that the value of your contracts add to the value of the sale. And what I mean by that, what I wrote down here is, can contracts with clients be assigned? And so that's a big one. Are there employment contracts in place for key employees, right? Because a
Right.
lot of times employees can act up with a new owner. It's like getting a substitute teacher. Chris told me I was up for a raise. I think the third one is like leases, right? When I'm looking, I'm like, what are the leases? 4 could be financing, right? Like, what are the financing? Are there liens against the company? And so my assumption would be your lawyer is going to look at all of this. And I love the idea really about you preparing the paperwork for the sale, not responding to the paperwork. But I would assume that you want your lawyer and your accountant to be talking to each other to make sure that all of that is sorted. And what I wrote here is capital gains exemption. A lot of times in a lot of jurisdictions, if you haven't sold a company before, there'll be a capital gains exemption, which means there's a certain amount of the sale price that you get tax-free. It's something government does just to kind of stimulate wealth building. And what I found out is in the United States, but not in Canada, in the United States, you can make your kids shareholders of your company. And you can spit out in some states, some of those, everyone gets a capital gains exemption. And so there are situations where, let's say, I don't know what it is in the state of Washington, but in Canada, I think it's $875,000. So the first $875,000 on the business sale, tax-free. And then you start paying capital gains, which is 50% of 50%, which is 25%. But if in Canada, you could structure like the States where each of my kids and my wife were each 25% shareholders, each person would get an $875,000, tax exemption. So, you could sell your company for $3.5 million and not pay any tax. And so I guess that would be your accountant talking to your attorney, talking to you and going, how do we get the most of this money out with the least amount of tax? Because of course, you know this as a financial professional as well, Steve, the more that kitty starts with, the more it's going to kind of support your retirement or your next step in life, I would guess.
Yes, to all of that. And the reason you talk to your CPA early is that the capital gains rules are both federal and state. And
Okay.
I'll just tell you, for example, Chris, in the state of Washington, there's an exemption if it's a individual LLC. But if it's a multi-member LLC, you may not get the exemption.
Okay.
So that's why you need to have the attorney. I'm not suggesting anybody change the governance of their company, but the way your company is set up, single person LLC, multi-purpose LLC, as sole proprietor, all of that has an impact on the tax implications of it. So you're exactly right. Your attorney and your CPA need to be talking to each other so that we are doing this the most effectively as we can. So one of the things I tell potential clients is, look, you want to exit effectively, efficiently, and profitably. That's
Right.
really what we're trying to get to. And one without the other two is not good enough, because once you're in this process, you want to move along as smoothly as you can. I wanted to mention something about attorneys too, by the way, that you have to guide the attorney in terms of the terms that you want to have in the final agreement. So there's 2 steps, and I won't go too far into it. But Chris, I don't know if you remember, but you and I struggled over the memo of understanding, or MOU, quite a bit to get it the way that I wanted it and be reflected. Well, that's a document that you can share during due diligence with a potential buyer. It just says this is our intention. And that's one of the things that a buyer, you'll find out what the buyer is interested in, because the two of you will create this memo of understanding. And from there, the attorney can draft the legal documents. But it's an essential step in your doing this when you're in the due diligence process, because that's the point at which you and the potential buyer are finally starting to say, okay, let's get down to it. Let's talk about what my role is going to be afterwards, and what the earnout is going to look like, and what are the terms and conditions, and assign a value that by now we've agreed on. So that's one step in this that, again, you don't need an attorney to draft an MOU. The attorney will do that. But remember, there's a step before you get to the sales document, the purchase sale agreement.
And so that's almost like the MOU is like the rules of engagement before the contract. I'm interested in buying your business. You're interested in selling it. This is what I think it's worth. This is how we would negotiate terms. Here's the role we would play. It's kind of like almost like workshopping the idea as you're going along. And then once you have the MOU kind of where you're both in agreement, then what you're saying, Steve, is you would have your lawyer draft a sale agreement based on the MOU. Because
Yeah.
then the lawyers are not going back and forth. Lawyers are, great at going back and forth. We try to minimize that in order just to keep the overhead of the transaction relatively low. One thing just wanted to add as you were talking that popped into my head is, and keeping in mind, I default to liking to overplan rather than to underplan. What I like about you starting to have conversations with some clients 5 years out is, let's say that they have that corp, right? They've set up a corp that might have been tax efficient operating wise, but not tax efficient sale wise. There's something called a tax rollover where you may want to roll your corporation into a different vehicle. And when that happens, there's a freeze, which means it freezes the value of where the existing corp is. It rolls it into the new corp, and you would pay a tax on that. You'd want to have that happen earlier than later, because assuming, as Steve talked about, you're ramping up the value and the revenue and the cash flow of the business, that gets more expensive the closer you get to transaction. So you'd want that freezable moment on the tax rollover from one corp to another, and which probably would make sense, talking to Steve sooner than later, just to see if that's something you and your accountant decide to do. Okay, next question. And kind of one I don't think is as common as I'd like it to be, is most owners, when they're ready to sell, they're like, I need to get out of here, right? I've had enough, right? Everything is good. Like lobster is good. Not every day. I'm ready to go. Let's talk about the different people that are impacted by a sale, aside from the buyer and the seller. So I made a list, Steve, of the ones that I had in mind, but you tell me if I missed any. And then maybe what we can do is go through each one by one and the considerations a seller should have. So I had employees, I had partners, right? So people that you do business with. I had vendors, so people that you buy from. I had clients, right? I had prospects. And then I had the general market, right? People that have become accustomed to you being part of the fixture of the firm and then not. So if you're open, and if I've missed any, those are just the top ones that kind of popped into my head. But I thought, let me ask you each one and maybe just share some ideas on considerations an owner would have. And I get that not all owners will be concerned about this. In my mind, communities build businesses. And if people helped you build your business, you want to make sure that they end up where they're supposed to be as part of your responsibility. You don't have to. It's just good karma. So let's maybe talk employees first. So when thinking about selling your business, what are some things you should think about?
Actually, you left off one that I thought you would have started with, which is potential other owners.
Oh, you mean other owners of the firm? Okay. Well, let's just nudge to the side that one and let's talk about that. What happened? Because I was under the assumption, and the conversation we were having, I was thinking single shingle. But you're
Mhm.
right. A lot of businesses have more than one owner. And so talk to me about what those conversations need to look like.
Well, and that's why I actually stopped, is that we tend to think of single business owners, but it's not always the case. And the first question you're going to have with another owner is, you're going to say, let's talk about interests here. And this is where an outside person like me can help you, because too often we take a position and I want people to talk about interests. So the way it might go, and to make it simple, we're just going to say that there are two co-owners that are roughly 50-50.
Okay.
Neither can do something without the other, right? So you have to approach the other owner and say, Jim or Sally or whatever, look, I'm kind of done with this. I want to do something different. And my interest is in making sure that you and our customers and everybody are well taken care of. Let's have a conversation about what that looks like. And the key here is to keep in mind that your interests and their interests may not be aligned, but you can find a way to find a middle ground in all of that. So I realize that that's a general comment, but sometimes I run into this conflict where one owner wants to keep running the business everything is great. Look at what we're doing. But the other owner is ready to leave. And that's a dicey conversation. That's one of the places where I have a background in mediation and negotiation. And that's where having a third person in the room can be really valuable. I just wanted to mention that if there are co-owners that are involved, that's a conversation you need to have fairly early and probably better with a third person in the room. So that's one. Another group that you didn't list, but I want to talk about is family, your family, because this is going to impact their family. And depending on what's going on, it can have a positive impact, a negative impact, but it affects them. And you're going to need them for support as you go along. So early on the conversations, you need to enlist the family and a spouse or whatever it is that's going on. So up front, those are two other potential what we call stakeholders. So one of the things that we do when we're assessing a business is we list all the stakeholders just as you did. And I would add in other owners, obviously, and family members. Okay, let's talk about employees. One of the issues for employees is when do you tell them, right? And every business has key employees. And you mentioned this earlier, which was a good point. If you have contracts with those employees, we need to be aware of what they are. So if you have employment contracts, one of the things I tell people is get out those doggone contracts and take a look at what they say. Because too often we do them and then we sort of forget the implications of it. In fact, Chris, I even had you look at one of mine recently because I couldn't remember. And it's been 3 years since we did it. And you took a look at it and said, well, this is what it is that I understand it says. And that's what happens is we tend to forget about that. So with employees, the first question is, do you have any employment contracts with them? And obviously you need to honor those contracts, what we're doing. And then the timing of the question. And I don't think that there's a perfect answer here. I will tell you my general impression is that once employees hear the business is going to be sold, their first question is, what does it mean to me? Absolutely their first question. And so you need to know the answer to that. And you won't know the answer to that until you've gone down the road a little bit further. So you're not going to talk to employees until you have gone further down the road. Because if you just say, hey, I'm thinking about selling the business, what's their question? What does this mean for me? And one of the things it's going to mean is that they're going to look for other jobs because they're going to assume the worst. And so the timing for employees is later versus early. And it's just a general feeling about doing this. But if you're the owner, you want it to be later rather than earlier. What would you add to that, Chris?
Well, I think that's dead on. It's a tightrope walking scenario, because if you tell them too early and they jump, it decreases the value of the company, and so you're selling to a seller without operators. If you tell them too late, then they feel like you've betrayed them and they could still jump anyway. But the one thing I kind of thought about when we talked about employment contracts is, I find this more with some of my female clients, is they tend to be much more generous in the employment contracts. And I often give them hell because I'm like, when you go to sell this company, no one's going to buy that contract. Like, I don't, this person is like a nephew to you or like a son. I don't care, right? I don't care if they've been loyal to you. They don't get to work 3 days a week and get paid for 5. And so that, that's one of the catches, is sometimes you actually have to clean up your employee pool and find the good employees and say, but again, the benefit of planning 5 years out, if people have sweetheart deals, can we say Russell Wilson for football fans, right? You get a new coach, new owner, who is like, that's not the employee that I wanted to buy. I'll give it a shot, but, and so that, I find that is one of the most tricky things when clients go, well, I really want to tell my staff because I want them to be excited. They are not excited. They're not happy for you because they're not thinking about you. They're thinking, do I have to find another job? Is my next boss going to be an a-hole? Are they going to make me do stuff that this person let me get away with? Like, it's not a happy time for most employees. Now, there's ways to soften a little bit for them. Normally financial compensation for making sure the transaction's smooth. But I think you hit it dead on the head when it doesn't matter even if they're your family. But what I meant is, even if they act like they're your family, when you say you're going to sell, they're going to feel betrayed and that you're putting them out. And so you have to be mindful of how you manage that. And again, with an advisor like Steve or someone that knows how to do that effectively, that really is a big difference between if you get rats on a ship or you get people that, have their arms open for the new owner. Welcome, new guy, new gal.
It is the trickiest of all of them. And again, I've said this to you before. It's an emotional time for you as the owner, and it's an emotional time for them. But you can't let your emotions push out the good business sense.
Right,
And that's easy to do. And because you care about your employees and you care about your customers, but you also have to care about the business. You're
right,
the only one. You're the only one that cares about the business. The new buyer doesn't, because they're going to write the contract the way they want to write it. The employees don't care because they aren't owners. You're the only one that cares about the business. It's sort of a lonely place to be. You're standing on the deck. You're standing on the deck at the wheel. You're the only one. And so, okay, next. Who do you want to talk about next? I thought you had the rest of them.
Well, so the next one I had was like partners, right? People who have come to be in business with you. It could be strategic alliances, champions, and so on. People that play a role in your business, and in cases, the one I'm most sensitive to is champions. People who refer business to you. You don't want to tell them, I would assume 5 years out, I'm going to sell the business in 5 years, because they're going to start looking for their next target, right? They're looking for the next person to deliver the ball to. And so what are your thoughts around when's a good time to start bringing them in the loop of that? Because I assume those people could also potentially find a buyer for you. They might know people who would want to buy. Am I right?
So it's an excellent point. In general, okay, and so not all partners and not all champions are created equal.
Hmm.
And I sat down with my champions list and actually divided it into two. Well, it's not even equal. There was a very small number that I told early, and those are the ones that will be happy for you. And those I told early. Everybody else was quite late in the game. And the rationale is you need to look at it and see, because your confidentiality is a big deal here. You
Right.
do not want to let the cat out of the bag too soon for your customers is the big issue. You don't want the customer to hear it from somebody else. And that's what drives this. Okay. I will just say I work with on the customer side first, which is they need to hear it from you, or the value of your business goes shh, right? That is the primary audience other than you and the buyer. It's got
Right.
to be the customer. You have to keep that in mind. So when I'm making my list of priorities, I always start with them and say, what do we need to do to keep servicing them? What do we need to do to keep them favorable? And so everybody else is secondary. I will just be really clear about this. You, the buyer, and you and the customers, because without customers, the business has no value, obviously, as we go along. But
Right.
generally speaking, the champions or the partners are later in the game, except for a chosen few.
Got it. Okay. And so then if we move on and we go to vendors, people that I would normally think, Steve, you tell vendors right when the transaction happens. However, I don't know about you, but I have deals with vendors that are preferred rates, right? And so part of the value of what I would do in selling a company is selling those preferred vendor agreements as well. So when would you start? I would assume relatively late in the process. Is that like when would you do
Yeah,
that?
yeah, late in it. And this is one of the reasons we do a SWAT analysis, which is a strength might be your relationships with vendors and the preferred rates that you have with them.
Right.
And it's not easy to put a dollar value on that necessarily, but boy, that's attractive to a buyer. So when you're doing your story, you want to talk about your relationships with the key vendors, the key suppliers, if it's a strength. And so I would say to a buyer, look, these are the relationships I have, and these are the preferred rates that I have. When would you like to have that conversation with them? It's relatively late, but typically that's done with the two of you. And you say to the vendor, okay, John or Sally or Susie, look, we're talking about selling the business. And I want you to meet the new buyer, the potential new buyer, because frankly, the relationship we have is one of the strengths of the business. It's an asset of the business. And I want to do that up front. So what does the buyer get out of that? The buyer gets, wow, this is really a valuable business. And look at that hidden asset and everything else. And the fact that you have those good relationships is a positive thing, because the buyer will think better of you. Conversely, if you're running a business where you're squeezing every vendor and you have bad relationships with them, you don't want them talking to the buyer. So I mean, it's an
Right.
easy way to think about that. Is that there's a company that I'm talking to right now, and they have a terrific relationship with a technical company that they work with, and that we're going to introduce that technical company because this company needs these other people to do things right. They have preferred rates, they have great relationships. That's an asset that we want to leverage the best we can for the potential buyer for the business. So relatively late, but keep in mind that there may be value in that relationships.
What I was thinking too, you want your vendors and your new owner to play nice, but I guess if you also have assignable contracts, right? So you have service agreements in place, it's kind of in everyone's interest to do that because the vendor still has to stay engaged. The vendor wants a client to continue to buy, which the new buyer is going to do. And so you're kind of almost like a matchmaker. Steve meet Chris, Chris meets Steve. Working with Steve for a long time. Chris is a new owner. You guys are going to do really well. The company's only growing. You'll do more business. I
Right.
look forward to seeing how you guys grow together and kind of keeping it positive, eh?
Yes, and that's where you go back to the lawyer to look at any of the agreements that you have to see the extent to which they're assignable. And everyone is done differently. You would like them to be assignable because then it
Right.
truly is an asset. And but when we were selling our business, our vendors were very low on the list because we didn't have agreements that were assignable. We told them, but that was about it. And I knew the new owner was going to have his own vendors in certain cases, but there's still a few that he uses that we brought on board. So that's a good thing.
Right. Well, so what about the market in general? And so I would assume, it's funny that, well, it's not funny. It's funny, but not haha funny, is a barber shop that I go to was owned by an ex-professional boxer. And his name was Danny O'Sullivan. And Danny was a hilarious guy, ran the barber shop. Wasn't really much of a barber, like he would cut the odd person's hair. But he basically just rocked the strip mall that it's in and harass other owners in a good way, right? Like just go in and tease the video store person, yada, yada, yada. And so when he passed away, he was sick. And we all knew he was sick, but he passed away and we didn't know what succession looked like. So I started heading downtown to get my hair cut. And then I got an email from his niece, and his niece had inherited the barber shop. And unbeknownst to all of us, for the year before when he was sick, she went to barber school, and she went and collected barbers to bring into the. And now it's primarily run by women. It's 6 or 7 barbers, one guy and 6 gals. It used to be, a real alpha male, macho boxer. You sit in there and BS with each other. And so I went back, and I mean, I've been going there since. But what it reminded me of, Steve, is if Danny had said, I want to leave this business to my niece. I've got her in barber school right now. I'm teaching her how to bring barbers in, and she's going to take great care of people. It's going to have a different vibe, but she won't embarrass me. I would have never even gone downtown. You know what I mean? Because nobody looks to change vendors unless they're angry. And I wasn't angry. I just figured the business was closing down, because we see it all the time. What happened to that Chinese restaurant? Oh, it went closed down. What happened to the dry cleaner? It went out of business. And so I think the question I would ask you is, there must be some consideration of how do you let the market know that ownership has changed, but not to be scared of that change. Like any ideas or thoughts around how you might approach that?
Yes, and there's good ways to do it, and there's bad ways to do it. And in general, you want to make it sound like it's a happy marriage. We're happy to announce that Steve and Chris have decided to go out of business, and they've assigned their business to Barb and Sue.
Right.
And it's more of an attitudinal thing, and it has to be done in a tone that reassures, because nobody likes to change vendors or suppliers or anything else. And that's where I'll just say this, all right. That's where the stories, and if you've chosen your successor well, you will be able to say in that announcement, and I've been pleased to serve in a certain way. And I'm delighted to indicate that the successor, John or Sue or Sally, has the same commitment to values like customer service and customers come first and supporting the local community and whatever. And so there's where the story we tell is going to be key. And it starts with who you choose as your buyer. If it's a good buyer, that'll be a very easy story to tell. If it's a buyer that is just jammed together, then it's a hard story to tell. I
Right.
say this all the time, that people don't want to make a change. So let's not give them a reason for doing it. Let's not, let's not raise prices. Let's not take a different attitude about it. Let's not make it easy for them to make that decision to change, because they would rather not. People would rather not make a change in that regard. So one of the parts of this that's interesting, Chris, is in the internet world that we're in, that's one of the aspects that we're going to have to look at is what's your LinkedIn profile and what's your
Oh,
Facebook profile,
right.
and was known as Twitter. Now it's X, right? Those are all parts of it that you look at. And so when you're doing this, when you're doing the transition planning with the new buyer, you look at all of those social medias that you didn't have to do 20 years ago. But
Mm,
now that's a part of it, and you need to get in front of it. And you want the story to be consistent. That's kind of the point. You want the story to be consistent so that no matter where, no matter who sees the announcement or the information, that it's a consistent one. LinkedIn is a good example. You don't want to all of a sudden just have your profile stop. You want to say, the business has been taken over by John or Sally or whatever the case may be. So it's a little bit more complicated than it used to be. There is the media, and then there's social media.
got it. Okay, and so with that kind of, and what I understand is that the story part of it, right? The story you're putting out internally and externally is something that you would work with clients to craft and all that. But let's talk about a person that doesn't really craft that story, but might play a role in the transaction. Let's talk about business brokers. And so I know some businesses choose to use a business broker, just very similar to people using a real estate agent to sell their house. And so talk to me about, things an owner wants to ask themselves as it relates to, does a business broker work with what I'm looking to accomplish?
So it's a great question, and this is one where you and I can go back and forth a little bit on it. But remember always that nobody cares about your business as much as you do.
Right.
Just like nobody cares about your house as much as you do. All right. And brokers in general get paid only when they sell a business. And so, and their fees can be quite high. There is no universal number, but in general, their fees are going to be somewhere between 10 and 20%. And
Okay.
so that's money that's going to come out of the sale of the business, right? So you have to be carefully considering what it is that they're going to do. Now, I listen to a lot of business brokers and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and they all talk a good story, right? But really, what they're doing is that they're listing your business, just like a real estate agent. Okay,
Hmm.
they really are just going to look at list your business. They're not going to give you counsel. They're not going to give you unbiased negotiation assistance. They don't take the place of the attorney or the CPA. The role of the broker is to get your business out in the most favorable light that we can to as many people as possible. And so that part of the process of selling a business, you're handing over to somebody, just like you're handing over the books to the CPA or the documents to a legal person. But no, two things. No, remember, nobody cares about your business as much as you do. And when you assign your business to a broker, you have lost control. And that's the part. It's probably going to be an exclusive listing, meaning even if you go out and find a buyer, they're going to get their percentage. Somebody comes in and says, "Steve, I just found out you're selling your business." They have to talk to the broker. You are captured in that regard. So you'll lose control is my big concern about it, and the cost. And because most business owners have never sold a business before, they can be taken advantage of by brokers. This is not denigrating all the brokers in the world. I'm simply saying recognize that you are losing control, and their interest is not in doing a good transition. It's doing a transition as quickly as they can at a highest price as they can. What would you add to that?
Yeah, what I found is, and that's the part that most people don't understand, is they go, well, hiring a broker will just give me an extra set of hands. But a lot of times, and like I'm not saying 50% of the time, but maybe 20 or 30% of the time, the owner finds a buyer. And so that 10 or 20% that you negotiated, even if the broker didn't bring you anybody, if it's within the time frame of that contract, you're paying them. And so what I like to suggest to people who are considering a broker, because some brokers are like realtors, right? There's some that are exceptional and some that are, just just running numbers, is give them a limited listing. You have 90 days. I'm going to give you 90 days. And I would still be promoting myself, give them 90 days. And if they're working it, you might extend them by another 90 days. If you're not liking where they are, you can you can finish it after 90 days and either find another broker or go it yourself. I sold, as an aside, I had an investment property up Island. Steve, I don't know if I told you the story, but I actually bought it for my wife as a joke for her birthday. Couldn't figure out what to buy her, and we were thinking about buying a cottage. And so I bought it. I'm like, here, happy birthday. And we bought it as an Airbnb rental to generate revenue off of. And so there was a lot of action in this cottage development during COVID because, of course, people, weren't hopping the border and stuff. And so the realtor that we bought it from, who was really good, like we back then in BC, you could do your own side of the transaction because my wife's a lawyer, she did our side. But now you have to have two realtors, like realtors can't double end in Canada. And so anyway, she called us and said, hey, I've got lots of action on your cottage. People want to buy, it was better for a young family than, our kids were growing up. And she goes, can I list it? And I'm like, no. She goes, why? I'm like, we're going to spend a week there at Christmas time. And she goes, just give me a listing for the weekend. And I'm like, what? Because normally they lock it up for 90 days or sometimes 180. And so I'm like, okay, talk to me about that. And she goes, I will get people ready to go. I will list it Friday. They can look Friday, Saturday, best offer on Sunday. If I don't bring you an offer you like, say no, and I'll kill the listing. So I said to my wife, I'm like, well, okay, let's see. Because I already was tracking what they were worth and we were doing good on it. And so anyway, I had a trip with friends to Montreal. And so she called on the Sunday and she's like, okay, I got 17 offers. Here's the number one offer. I got you your week at Christmas time. We'll complete January 1. Here's the number. And I'm like, sold. Don't even sold, right? And so that was, of all of the brokers that I've used throughout my life, I'm like, this is a hustler that wants to get it done, knows the value of what I have, and found a market. And so I think, to your point, if you can find a broker that is really in tune with the business you're in,
Right.
and may have a buyer pool that they can go into, as mine did, like she worked, but she didn't work. Like, she's not working the phones 10 hours. She had been working that market for 4 years. And so she knew there were 100 people that wanted to buy it. She'd get 20 offers, right? So I guess that's what I would say is there are some exceptional brokers and a lot that aren't. Do not jump into anything because somebody says, oh, I can sell X, Y, and Z. If they have someone like you in their corner and even their lawyer to have a conversation with, that would be good to have a second set of eyes. Don't get excited about, I'm tired of my business, I just want it sold. You got to make sure you're doing it properly.
Yeah, to that end, by the way, yes to all of that. I know several brokers that are very good, to be honest with you, but
Okay.
that is more the exception than the rule.
Yes.
And particularly brokers that know your industry, which is what you were alluding to. If you are I'm just going to use this. If you are a graphic designer and you have somebody that really knows that space, that if you have a broker that knows that space, that's a good thing. Or if you're a light manufacturer for airplane parts and you have a broker in that space, that's good because they're probably sitting on a pool, just like you said, of potential buyers. And a limited contract, a 90-day contract is what I would say. But it leads me to something I want to bring up, which is, and you've heard me say this, I think, that there are 5 reasons that businesses don't sell. But here's an interesting point. 70 to 80% of businesses that are for sale don't sell. 70 to 80.
4 out of 5. 4 out of 5 don't sell.
Yeah.
What happens? They just close down?
Generally, they just close down.
Oof.
Yeah. And the reason they don't, the 5 reasons real quick. Unrealistic expectations about the value of the business, poor record keeping, poor records and financials and as we go along. Failure doing the due diligence process because people get to be kind of set in their way
Complacent, yeah, complacent, yeah.
as they go on. A lack of a plan, because that's really one of the things that happens is that if it's chaotic as we go along and we do that. And then the last item is not having good resources. You end up with a broker and that's all that you have. And the broker, isn't a good broker. You end up with a poor broker. But think about this, 70 to 80%, 4 out of 5 don't sell. And that's a scary number. And when I say this to people, even if a broker says, I can sell your business, don't believe them.
Right.
Because 4 out of 5 are not going to sell. And these are just for businesses that are indeed the owner wants to sell. So typically they just close the doors, which is a lost opportunity. And one of the things that I say to people is you've spent a lifetime of building this business. Don't just let it go away. That's not fair to you. It's not fair to your customers. It's not fair to your employees. So you can do something about that, but you have to start early and you have to have a plan. And if you start early enough and you have a good plan, we can probably get your business sold. It's not always going to be at the price or the terms you want. But if you start early and you have a good plan, you can probably get a business sold, because if your business is viable, remember, we're going to do that assessment. If your business is viable, if it has value, we'll find a buyer for it.
Well, as you say that, like the 4 out of 5 is shocking, right? Like almost nauseating. And I was thinking that imagine if you bought a used car and you said, here's a used car. You're going to put $50,000 into it to make sure it runs well. And at the end, after 5 years of driving it, you have a 1 in 5 chance of ever selling it. No one would buy a car, right? And so this is the catch. I mean, you know this. You've been a business owner. We've been business owners about the same amount of time in our lives, right? So I'm going on 30 years. And nobody other than an owner knows how much sunk time gets put into business that we're never compensated for.
Oh, yeah.
So you might as well go to the mines and dig coal, right? You'd be compensated better when it comes to hourly rate. And so, geez, Steve, you've ruined my day. 4 out of 5 just shut the doors. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so with that, 2 more questions, because I know I've taken more time than you agreed to, but thank you. I'll make it up to you at some point. What are some of the risks that come within the process of selling a company? So what are some of the dangers that come out of that? You had already talked about employees maybe jumping ship or clients finding out from someone else. Are there other things that, like landmines, people should be aware of when they're exploring this?
It's a great question, and it's unfortunate because I stepped on a bunch of those landmines when I sold my business. So hopefully I can guide people to not do the same thing, right? One of them is people don't understand how emotionally trying it is to sell a business. When you're trying to run a business and sell it, that's a very emotional time and it's exhausting. So it's like having 2 primary focuses that are kind of opposite each other as you go along. It's really an interesting scenario when you're trying to sell a business, and you know this, Chris. There are ups and downs, and the emotional side of that is something that you can't believe. It doesn't seem possible that I can have all these emotional ups and downs, given that I'm selling my doggone business. It's a roller coaster of emotions, and a lot of people don't expect that. Okay. Another one is as you realize that your business is going to be sold, all of a sudden there's a fear of, I am my business. If I sell my business, then who am I?
Right.
You used to be this, what's my title? You
Right.
used to be the CEO, the boss, the top dog. Well, now you're not sure what to call yourself. And you have to look beyond it. You have to have a plan beyond when you're selling your business. And too many entrepreneurs don't think about that. And then all of a sudden the business is done. And it's like, well, what do I do now? So that's one of the landmines that you can fall into inadvertently. I have another one for you too, which is if you wait too long to sell the business, there's a lack of energy, and people will people will recognize that. All of a sudden, you're just not as
Mm.
tuned in. You stop hustling, you stop selling. So that's not an easy thing to do. And it kind of goes back to my first point about the emotional ups and downs. But you have to keep running the business. You have to keep working at it. You can't stop doing that. Just because you've decided you're at to use a football analogy, you're at the 20-yard line, you can't stop. You haven't scored it yet. You haven't pushed it over the goal line. So those are some of the things that you can run into. The emotional one was one that surprised me. Another one that surprised me is how hard it is to run a business and sell it at the same time. A third one is I hadn't given enough thought to what I was going to do next. And so the day after my business was sold, I was kind of like, okay, well, now what do I do? I didn't do a very good job of planning. Luckily, I filled it in because I had a really good coach who stayed on me to make sure that I found something to do. And
And reminded you that fishing isn't a career.
fishing's
At
a
least the
hobby.
way you at least the way you fish.
Ah, good one. It's true. It's true. What are the other landmines have you seen as somebody is selling a business?
I think the emotional one is key, and I think we talked about this during your transaction. Is when I said steady, like just be steady, is that up and down, and that's what I experienced when I went through it kind of the first time as well. Is I'm like, okay, I have an owner or I have a buyer here, like quickly take it, like just get me out of here, and that's where I used to be hypocritical, as I'd always say to clients, there's only two times when you stop doing business development: when you sell your company or when you die. Right. And so that was my way of saying, even when you're on holiday, look for your opportunities. But I realized that that was all BS until I was actually in the situation of a transaction where I'm calling on prospects to close business that I know I won't serve. And so my mentor at the time was a gentleman named Alvin Kahn, who was the head honcho at Intel. And he said, you have to act, and you remember me telling you this, Steve, you have to assume your transaction is going to blow up at the 1 yard mark. And so this is going to be your business forever. And so I would go out and sell, praying to God the transaction would go through, but acting as if it wouldn't. And so when it did go through, the benefit of doing that, of course, Steve, is there is an adjustment right at the moment of transaction where the company is worth that much more. Whatever contracts you added from the point of the MOU to that, then the adjustment happens. And so, I got handsomely compensated for all that new business that I brought in during that time. Because my window was about 6 months from basically agreeing to the MOU to the transfer of ownership, and the longest 6 months of my life.
And that my experience on my own and with other clients, the same thing. Once the MOU is there, it's about 6 months. If it goes longer than that, just talking timeline. If it goes longer than that, then there's something wrong.
Right.
Because you ought to be able from MOU to close ought to be about 6 months in something regard. But I think it's a great question. The two things that I caution clients about is the emotional challenges of doing it and how hard it is to keep selling and running the business even though you're getting rid of the business. Those were I may have intellectually understood that, but when you're in it, it really hit me. And that's again the value of having an outside coach or whoever it is that you're working with to help you stay focused on what it is that you're doing along that line. And family plays a really important part of this. I will just say this, that in my case, my beautiful wife was there constantly, and she rose to the challenge, and she understood what I was going through and didn't try to get involved with it, but just tried to be supportive of me. You need a team around you that will support you during those emotional ups and downs. Okay.
And take you out for the tacos and margaritas to keep your mind sane, right? And then just that last part to that, and if you have time, I have one last question, but you'll remember what I said to you is the first 90% of the transaction is not dangerous. The last 10% is the danger zone, right? That's when the lawyers are coming to an agreement, you're coming up with the financing. That last 10% is 90% of the work. The first 90% is just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But remember, I said to you, okay, we're officially in the danger zone now. We have to keep our finger on the pulse of this to make sure it doesn't go off kind of course. Okay, last and final question, Steve, and I will let you go. And it's funny because this might be a little more of an involved question, but bear with me. The company is sold The keys go to the new parent, the new owner, the new master. What happens to the seller after that?
That is it's a great question, and so the short answer is it depends on the role the owner is going to play going forward. Okay, so if the owner is going to have a limited role, like a consulting role, that's one thing. If the owner is going to be around to help in the transition, that's another thing. So some of the answer to that is that it depends. But one of the things that is really interesting is that the owner is going to go through what I call the business nostalgia part, which is all of a sudden somebody else is making decisions, maybe not even ones that you would make, and that's a hard one to go through. You're going to get that. You're going to get that sort of nostalgia hit that goes along with it, and there will also be an opportunity for you to second guess everything you did or didn't do. Second guessing stage, the Monday morning quarterback, all those kinds of things. One of the items is that you may get some unexpected queries about your business, even after the business is sold.
You mean from potential buyers? Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yep. And that is one of the items about you obviously you have to find a good way to do that. But I had a couple of queries about my business, and they were talking, one of them was from private equity, and they were talking about bigger multiples than I got. And so it was one of those, oh no, I missed an opportunity, right? It wasn't terrible, but it was sort of amusing at the same time. And the private equity person was very nice about it. And they said, well, do you know any other businesses? So it was that regard. But just because you've stepped out of being the lead role doesn't mean people aren't still going to be reaching out to you. And that happens to me on LinkedIn all the time. I have people reaching out to me because they knew me in my earlier life.
Right.
Part of it is that I will tell this to anybody that is selling a business. It depends on your transition plan, And that's one of the items that I would insist working with a client, even though the focus is on the transition day. Here's a good analogy. So when people get married, there's so much energy that goes into the wedding day, all the stuff that goes into it, and it's a big party and everything else. What happens the day after? You
Right.
may go on a honeymoon. I get that. But okay, what happens the day after the honeymoon? That's the best analogy that I can think of. And so I insist that people that I work with have a transition plan. And depending on what it is that they're going to do, it may be 12 to 18 months of doing nothing or winding down, maybe 12 to 18 months where they spend time doing hobbies, or a friend of mine who sold his business had 12 to 18 months of the honey-do list. He was a fix-it guy. And so he spent 12 to 18 months of fixing everything that you can imagine. But almost exactly at 18 months, he said, now what? And
Right.
so the what happens afterwards, you have to let go. That's not an easy thing to do. If people come to you, and particularly if you're around, if people come to you and say, Chris, how do you want to handle, or how should we handle X, Y, and Z? You have to resist the temptation to answer the question.
Right.
You might get inquiries from other people. Your role is different. Your identity, your ego, all those things are different. So the best way to handle that is to have a transition plan for you individually
Right.
as you go along. Because I will tell you this, that unless you've done it before, you've never sold a business that you've built before, it's traumatic for you. There's a big change, and you need to allow that time to make the transition. What were your experiences? I mean, what would you add to that?
Well, I think I was laughing because I remember when I exited Think Tank, which I had built for 8 years, and I already had GoSeo, which was kind of my side gig, right? I was doing that on my own. And so my wife and I planned a trip to Italy, kind of to your point. And we're like, okay, we're going to go to Italy, have a reset. And I'm in Italy and I'm miserable. Right? I mean, granted, I'm dabbing my eyes with $100 bills, but I'm like, because I was 33 at the time. And I'm like, okay, well, one hit wonder, right? That's now what am I going to do, right? Because to your point, I was all balled up into 8 years of building this juggernaut of a market research firm, which I didn't particularly like, right? It was easy to build a business, but I didn't like the day-to-day work, which is why I had kind of teams that liked to do it. And so, my wife's like, let's go to this church. I'm like, I don't want to go to that church. Let's go here. I don't want to go here. So I actually went into what I would assume to be almost a quasi-depression, because I had invested 7 days a week for 8 years building this thing, and now it was gone. And I wasn't like, bye, Feline or Felicia, right? Like I wasn't like that. But when I handed it over, to your point, I remember the first day when the new person came in and I was thinking, that's not how you print those reports, right? Like, that's not how you do that, right? That's not the right way to do email. But it's not mine anymore, right? You got to kill the baby. And, thankfully, I mean, you and I both lucked out on who we married. And my wife had said, well, why don't you license Go CEO and build that coaching practice out? I'm like, no, nobody can do it but me, right? It's only me. And then she's like, well, if you're the guy that you tell everybody you are, you can probably do it. And so while she was visiting churches, I was busily sitting in cafes in Italy forming what, has now become the Go CEO. And so if I didn't have kind of something already in hand, I think that the depression lasted, I'm going to say maybe a week, and I'm in Tuscany. I mean, how embarrassing is that? I'm in Tuscany depressed, but because I'm a guy that takes a lot of pleasure in my work, what I realized is my pleasure is in doing work, not doing just that work. And so finding that new, reason, like I like to build. And so finding that was really helpful in me transitioning. And that's why with clients that go through it as well, I have a client, I think I may have told you, Steve, that sold a agricultural tech company and got divorced, sold the company, like all of these transitions. And so I said to her, well, you got to plan something to kind of get yourself out of where you are and to start things new. And she's like, oh, I've already decided I'm moving to Greece for a year. And I'm like, oh, you're going to sell your house? No, I'm not. Don't be ridiculous. I like my house. Basically, just left everything for a year, went to Greece, found love, like all of that stuff, and then came back and she's like, okay, ready to get started. Here's the next idea. And I'm like I had already kind of given her spot up. And so I had to scramble to find her a spot because she's like, okay, I took 6 months. I enjoyed the beaches. I drank grappa or whatever they drink over there, found someone to love, was thinking about my idea. Here, let's execute. And so most entrepreneurs don't stay retired, even if their business retires them, but you should have the option. Money should never be the reason, if you've built a company, to have to go build another company if you do it properly.
I agree. And one of the messages in this is that needs to be part of your transition plan. If you wait until the day after, you're going to go through that depression, all those kinds of things. And one of the things, as a former financial advisor, I'm very familiar with the part about what happens next, after
Right.
retirement or whatever. And the three keys are where you live, what you do, and who you do it with. It's the same thing when you sell your business. What you do, where you live, and who you do it with is a key. And we will answer that question. We will have that conversation. Even if you're not ready to make a decision, we need to enter that into the conversation so that the day after isn't such a shock as it was for you. I can't believe that it only lasted a week. I think you're a better man than many people are. That's for sure. Because it's a shock.
Well, and I hate to compliment you, but that's obviously a strength. Is I think, how many people have you retired in your investment career? And so you've seen this probably more than anyone else in the space of working with businesses to transition and to sell. And so you've probably seen the people, hey, I can't wait to be retired. And they're like, what the heck am I going to do? And their spouse is like, I'm used to you not being in the house. Go find something to do. And so that's an added thing that you're bringing, a layer that I don't think most people, I didn't think about what happened next. I'm like, oh, something will come up. I'm not a guy that can just sit and hope something comes up. I need to kind of know, even if I'm not doing it now, I need to know what that thing could be. And so, yeah, it was about a week of, I remember saying to friends, they go, how's Tuscany? It's fine. And they're like, isn't the food great? It's okay. Right. And they're like, really? And I'm like, it's all right. Like, I wish I was home. Because I wish I was home building something. And so luckily, when my wife said, well, think about this, went and got a pad of paper. And then when she was visiting every church that looks identical in Italy, sorry, Italian people, they all look the same. I was sitting in cafes starting to write down, what would it look like to have 10 Go CEOs? Okay, within closing then, Steve, tell everybody where they can find you. And so, as everyone can probably guess, Steve and I have worked together for a long time. He's a dear friend to me and someone that has the full endorsement of Go CEO. So we have no hesitation, happily, to recommend him to any of our clients. Where can people connect with you, Steve, to find out a bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. And if people can go to the website, which is bridgegatepartners.com, or I have a special report that they can get at simplebusinessexit.com. So those are the two things that they need to look at. The special report talks about the 5 things that you need to do in order to exit a business, and I broken it down into five simple steps. And you can find that report plus a lot of other information at the website, bridgegatepartners.com. And I love to talk to people. Chris knows this. It's one of the great things that I do, which is if you want to talk to me, just give me a phone call, and my number is on the website. I love talking to people and doing those exploratory get acquainted sessions. It's one of the great joys. And I'm naturally curious. I will ask you lots of questions and will uncover what's going on for you and where you're going. So either website or get the special report or give me a phone call.
And I think, yeah, Steve, like us, what we share in common is even if what Steve does doesn't fit for where you are right now, he's going to leave you better than he finds you through that phone call. So Steve, maybe just give people, we'll put all the information down in the description as well. What's the best number? Just give the number so people can write it down if they want it right now.
Sure, 425-829-5953.
Perfect. Okay. Well, listen, thanks everybody for joining Steve and I. We might have to do more of these because I had more questions, but as I was looking at us running over the hour, I started to feel guilty, which is rare for me because I don't normally feel that emotion. But Steve probably needs to go fishing. It's probably something can be caught today. Anyway, everybody, thanks for checking in. And if you have any questions, we'll maybe track comments as well afterwards. You can put them down in the comments below, but reach out to Steve. If you're 5 years or tighter in when you're thinking about retiring, 54321, drop him a note and he'll give you some insights on how to do it well. Anyway, thanks everybody, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks, Chris. Take care.
All right.